Good afternoon or good evening. My name's Ronan O'Malley. I'm with the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Wonderful to be here, and it's always wonderful to work in collaboration and cooperation with the Baker Institute. As many of you know who are members, we've been very fortunate many times to have hosted, and we'll host again in the future, both Ambassador Satterfield and also many of the excellent fellows here at the Baker Institute. And tonight, I'm delighted to open this introduction on U.S. and international assistance in a post-USAID era, global impact and future directions. Obviously, it comes at a very critical moment as we examine the changing landscape of global aid and development. And it's my privilege, my honor, to introduce someone who is a friend of the World Affairs Council and obviously a great friend of the Baker Institute, Professor Andrew Natsios. Andrew S. Natsios is Executive Professor and Director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the George H.W. Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. He was a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and the former administrator of U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, from 2001 to 2006. He serves as the co-chairman emeritus of the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea, a research center in Washington, D.C. He also served the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan from 2006 to 2007 to deal with the Darfur crisis and the implementation of the South Sudan peace agreement. Retired from the U.S. Army Reserves as a lieutenant colonel after 23 years, Natsios is a veteran of the Gulf War, and from 1993 to 1998, he was the vice president of World Vision U.S., the international nonprofit, non-governmental organization. Earlier in his career, he served in the Massachusetts state government as a member of the House of Representatives in Boston for 12 years, and later as the Secretary of the Administration of Finance, the Chief Financial Administrative Officer of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He also served as the CEO of Boston's Big Dig, the largest construction project in American history, after a cost overrun scandal. And he is the author of 3 books, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Great North Korean Famine, and his latest book, Sudan, South Sudan, and Darfur, What Everyone Needs to Know, published by Oxford University Press. And he's contributed to over 13 other books related to North Korea and other areas. And his areas of research are food security, famine, humanitarian assistance, during conflict, human rights, and foreign aid. And this evening, someone who, for most of you, needs no introduction, but many of you know well, and everyone in Houston we're all very fortunate to have, is Ambassador David Satterfield. Ambassador Satterfield has over 4 decades of diplomatic service and policy management experience in the United States and overseas in the Near East and Europe. He has served as Assistant Secretary of State, National Security Council Staff Director, Ambassador to Lebanon, Ambassador to Turkey, and Charge d'Affaires in both Iraq and Egypt. In October 2023, President Biden appointed him as White House Special Envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues to lead U.S. diplomacy in addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. In April 2024, he stepped down from this role and continues to serve as a consultant to the Department of State. Currently, Ambassador Satterfield serves as director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. The Baker Institute's more than 100 expert fellows and research associates focus on a range of public policy issues of importance to Texas, the nation, and the world. The Institute's Center for Energy Studies is widely regarded as premier global analysis and policy recommendation group, and the Baker Institute is ranked as one of only 2 centers of excellence amongst all academically affiliated institutions in the United States. So please join me in welcoming Professor Natsios and Ambassador Satterfield. Thank you.
I do want to clarify one thing. The cost overrun scandal took place before I went. I did not cause the scandal. I was sent in to clean it up. I just wanted to clarify that little thing, please.
Thank you very much. Delighted to see you all here. The academic year has ended at Rice University this past year. I hereby repute that A&M does graduate some folks every year. I'm not sure how accurate that is,
yes,
but I assume as well you're facing. We appreciate, Andrew, your coming to Houston. Appreciate all of you being here. There is no single person better able to speak from a position of both personal experience but also strategic vision on the broad question, not just of USAID and the impact of the recent dismantlement, but on the global structures, plural, of humanitarian assistance, how they came to be, what they do or did, and most important for all of us, where they're going and what the consequences are for Americans. I will simply note those consequences are real, they are discernible and quantifiable. There are tens of millions of dollars of commodities destined for USAID distribution that were sitting in the Port of Houston with the farmers who provided them unpaid for what they were doing. That is one micro piece of a much bigger issue, but the most important thing is consequences. And Andrew, the floor is yours to open up. What's happening and what does it mean?
The first thing people ask me is how we benefit from this. Now, from my perspective, this is all a moral issue. I was trained by the Jesuits at Georgetown 55 years ago. That argument, if you talk to church people or people in a mosque or a synagogue, they listen, but that's not moving Washington right now, I have to tell you. So for me, and I'm not inventing this, there is a strategic argument, but there's a very, very parochial argument. How many people in this room ate a sandwich made from wheat bread this week? Okay, you know you were eating USAID wheat? Did you know that? Let me tell you, the Green Revolution is the second greatest accomplishment of USAID. I asked Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1970 for creating the Green Revolution, but I said, one man can't, and he had a colleague in India, Indian agricultural scientist, who I think may still be alive. I said, you didn't do it alone. He said, the World Bank takes credit. He said, Andrew, no offense to anybody who's from the World Bank did, it's AID who implemented it. In fact, as I was researching an article on this, 50% of the budget of AID in 1970 was being used to implement the Green Revolution, one of the greatest revolutions in the 20th century. The National Academy of Science, our top scientific institution, created by my hero, Abraham Lincoln, one of his many accomplishments that had nothing to do with the Civil War. He created our top science. They did a retrospective of 50 years in the Green Revolution. They said in it, written by the way by an Indian economist, that there was a tripling, 300% increase in food production with only a 30% increase in the land area being cultivated because of the Green Revolution. Now, to institutionalize it, we created what's called, I had nothing to do with it, I was in high school at the time, the CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. My students know if they get that wrong at the final exam, they fail, I'm exaggerating slightly, they fail the class. They have to know the CGIAR. I chaired one of the committees on the CGIAR, it's called Harvest Plus, breeding micronutrients into poor people's diets. So the CGIAR is a vast network that almost no one's ever heard, unless you're an agricultural scientist in the global south, you don't know what the CG system is. AID helped create it in the late 60s. There are tens of thousands of scientists who belong to it, and there are centers focused on different crops. Bananas in Nigeria, potatoes in Peru, corn or maize in Mexico, wheat, I believe, in India, rice at Erie in Philippines, fish farming in the Philippines. I could go through them all. There are 14 left. 4 of them have closed. $700 million a year. The largest donor for 60 years has been USAID. Why does that have to do with what you ate last week? There was a wheat rust that was spreading across the world, destroying the wheat crop. And it was extremely dangerous. Dr. Borlaug told me, he was still alive, he was in his 90s. He said, Andrew, if this continues, there's going to be a mass famine. And it won't just be in the south. We're going to have problems in the north as well, and no one's focusing on it. And then the entire aid part of the budget was they deleted all the funding once AID lost control of the budget. And because no one knew what it was. No offense, David, it was the State Department. And they didn't do it maliciously. Dr. Borlaug went ballistic. He was yelling at me. I said, Dr. Borlaug, I didn't do it. I'm teaching at Georgetown. Don't get upset with me. He said, Andrew, we've got to stop this. I said, well, you can stop it. Anything you say, everybody listens to. Anyway, the CG system bred a seed that was resistant, wheat seed that was resistant to the fungus. 60% of the wheat grown in the United States comes from the CG system that was funded by USAID. Now that seed is available to anybody in the world. It's a public good. It is not owned by any seed company. Anybody can use it. We breed it for the South, but the North uses it too. And have anybody, now I know there may be some vegetarians here. Any people eat any beef from Texas? Okay? You are eating USAID beef. In a matter of speaking, I'm slightly exaggerating, as you can tell. Okay, how is that? I was doing a study of the effects of Hurricane Harvey for George P. Bush, the state land commissioner. He called me, he's the grandson of Jeb. I wish he was Attorney General, but that's another question here. He asked me if I would do a study of the structure of state and federal law that failed during Hurricane Harvey. So I was going through rural southern Texas, and I saw these vast fields of sorghum. Now, most of you never heard of sorghum. Sorghum is eaten as a crop. I eat sorghum bread all the time when I go to Africa and Latin America as well. But it's grown here for animals. And this crop of sorghum was red. And I said, that's Reagan sorghum. The Africans call it Reagan sorghum because it came out when Reagan was president, and it's red. The color of it's a different color. Who bred that? The CG system did. And the farmers from Texas came to AID and said, thank you for breeding this. It's twice as productive as the sorghum we grew, has more protein in it, and is resistant to all these diseases. Guess where it comes from? The CG system. The CG system is going to be in shock very shortly because their budget is losing $100 million from AID because AID doesn't exist anymore, and they lined out that from the budget. Now, I could go on for the next 4 hours with stories. I could tell you about tilapia. Have you ever had tilapia from the Nile River? No, you know? They don't grow it. It comes from the Nile River. Guess what? Why you eat it? AID moved it in the 60s to fish farm in fish farming for the first time for commercial export purposes in the Philippines. It became part of the CG system, but AID started it. The commercial export of tilapia, which is a third of the fish we eat in the United States, is an AID invention. Now, again, I could go on, but that's just in food. I could go on for other things as well. By destroying the agency, we are destroying ourselves. Now, let me just say, I am a Republican one of the old order, I call it, not the new order. Populism is not the philosophy of the Republican Party, the one that I grew up in for 50 years. And I believe in free markets. I do not like tariffs at all. I believe the state should run things, but AID, in my view, just like the State Department, is one of the first functions of the federal government in the Constitution. The State Department and the Defense Department and the judicial system are in the Constitution. We are part of the foreign policy of the United States, and we need to rethink what we're doing to deal with the fact that Pope Leo just said this, and I'm not Roman Catholic, I'm an Orthodox Christian, but he said, we are slow moving to World War III. Now, if he said it, I can now say it without being accused of saying crazy things. But I do think we are in the early, this is 1938 in Europe. I think we're at a dangerous stage right now. I don't have confidence that George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft and Colin Powell, another favorite person of mine, are in charge. I'm not going to make any more comments than that, in order to guide us through this. Now, maybe people will evolve. I'm sorry, you asked me one question, I can't stop talking. You did notice that.
I'm just sitting here, Andrew.
Okay, one last point. I noticed that Vice President Vance, who's a very smart guy, I mean, he has almost no experience in government. He's 2 years in the Senate. The old system that I was brought up in is you start running for local office, then you run for the state legislature, and then you take jobs in state government, then you're a congressman, a US senator, or a governor, and then you run for president. It doesn't quite happen that way anymore. But anyway, he said, what happens between India and Pakistan is none of our business. He said that. I was saying, if they both have nuclear weapons, I'm not sure he was aware of that, and if they start shooting each other with nuclear weapons, it most definitely has something to do with us. Okay? Guess who arranged the ceasefire? The United States did. The next day, after he said, we're not doing this anymore. Because I remember there was almost a war between Pakistan and India. When I was administrator, I used to go to the morning staff meetings with Colin Powell, and he sent Armitage, who was very close to the Pakistanis. He said, you need to tell them to calm this down before it starts a war. And President Bush and Colin Powell dealt with the Indian government. And we diffused things, and there was not even bombing, what just happened. But the United States, regardless who's the president, acted as a mediator to diffuse situations that you never even know are going on.
With an ally, the UK.
That's correct. That's right. And we have 58 allies. We did. We're alienating them, and I mean, I don't know why you're needlessly insulting people who are not insulting us. I mean, the Europeans annoy me sometimes, I have to tell you, but I don't allow that to get in the way of cooperating. We cooperated with them in a very constructive way on Darfur, and we couldn't have done what we did in Darfur without the Africans working with us as well, and the Arab nations as well. You don't do this alone. Bob Zellick, who's another favorite person of mine, said, I don't have a problem with America first, I have a big problem with America alone. It's a very dangerous idea, a very dangerous idea. So anyway, just to conclude your first question, this will go on for 3 or 4 hours at this rate, for me, it's an abomination that we destroyed, in 2 weeks, we destroyed AID. What took 60 years to build.
And Andrew.
I can see there's some retired AID officers in the audience, maybe. Okay.
Andrew, there is a popular perception
Yes.
that USAID, or the concept of significant U.S. foreign assistance, is a relic of 1945 and the Cold War, and that really it's been running and growing on inertia in the years since 89, 90, 91. The actual story is a very different one.
Absolutely different. So let me just, I like to use outside authors because if you talk to aid people, they all think everything we do is wonderful, which is not true. I mean, we do some things sometimes that don't work. I can admit that. And I did some things that failed. I also admit that. But we also did some extraordinary things. Do you know that American business invested $60 billion through public-private partnerships? It's the program I started. 2002, it was for 2001, it was the first thing I approved illegally because I had not been confirmed by the Senate. You're not supposed to approve things. And I told the career people, if you tell anyone I've signed this document, I didn't put a date on it, I will throw you out the 4-story window because I'll get impeached. You're not supposed to make any decisions, but I did. And no one complained because it was something a conservative could support, like me, and all administrators have expanded the program. It amounts to $6 billion a year. So when they were trashing AID in the Congress, I said, why would American business invest $60 billion in something that doesn't work and is a relic? Obviously, they see some benefit to it. I asked the president of Cisco Systems why she was asking for our help with a internet cafe program where they're building 200 internet cafes in Africa. I said, well, what are you going to do with the internet cafes? He said, we're going to have training for people on use of computers and the internet and all that. And I said, you want $3 million from us, basically not in money, but in services. He said, Andrew, you wrote most of the laws in Africa for bringing the internet and cell phone technology into these countries. I don't think most people know that. I'm sure that this guy, I can't remember his name, Musk, is that his name? I have trouble remembering his name. I'm so annoyed right now. So he should have checked AID introduced the internet to 22 African countries. I don't mean just the laws, I mean to actually bring the technology. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we had a guru, and AID was an expert in this. Anyway, AID was deeply involved in the extension of the internet to the developing world, and because it has profound implications for development and for the United States. Anyway, I asked the president, why do you want us? She said, we don't know who to talk to. We don't know who's corrupt, who's going to ask for a bribe. We don't know what the statutes say in the country. So you are our advisors, and I'm going to get into, are you going to get in trouble with the other companies? I said, they come in, a couple of them came in and said, why are you helping them? I said, do you want to invest in 200? Because they're putting $200 million with 200 internet cafes in countries all over sub-Saharan Africa. And I said, if you do the same thing, we'll help you exactly the same way. Otherwise, don't complain. The door is there. Come back in when you're ready to invest money. We invested with, I had Senator Leahy was complaining, his staff was complaining. Tim Reeser complained too much sometimes, annoyed me. He complained about this whole thing. He said, we don't control all this private money. I said, maybe that's better that you don't control it all. But we invested with Starbucks coffee and Green Mountain coffee in Rwanda, where the worst coffee in Africa was Rwandan coffee. And when we finished, it was the best coffee in Africa. It went from $3 a kilo to $12 a kilo. That's the Coffee Institute at A&M. This is before I went to A&M. There's no conflict of interest. Kagame talks about it all the time, the president of Rwanda. He never mentions it was an aid project, which we worked with the Ministry of Agriculture, and CRS was involved, and I think CARE was involved in terms of the field service. But the improvement of the beans was the Texas A&M Coffee Institute, and it worked. We don't give any money to it now. It was not very expensive, but it increased by 450%, according to an outside evaluation of the 50,000 coffee farmers. Now, their base is very small, but you're up to $1,200 a year in income. That's not bad for a very poor country, and that's what happened. That is a global development alliance. It's an alliance with the private sector supplied. It's not charity. When you know what they said at OMB? Political appointee. He said, this is charity. We got to get out of charity. AID does not do charity. They do development work. Do you know the difference? They didn't even understand basic development theory. That's what that annoys me so much about this. Now, one last comment about, I keep saying it's the last comment, obviously. It's not the last comment. There is a thing I learned in graduate school. I hesitate saying it here. It's the Kennedy School to get my master's degree. And
they're the other center of excellence.
That's right, the other center of excellence. Yes, right. Yeah. We just had the dean of the Kennedy School visit Texas A&M and the Bush School. He said, why do you want to talk to us? Anyway, so the Kennedy School, the first thing you learn is a statement by Wallace Sayers, who was the dean of the School of Public Administration in 1958 in Columbia University. He said famously, I'm paraphrasing, public management and private management are alike in every unimportant way. Every unimportant, they look the same, they are not the same. I've been boards of directors of private companies. There isn't even remote comparison by what we deal with and what the federal government deals with. I ran a large federal agency. I was basically the chief operating officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I know very much the difference between public and private management. The problem with the whole concept of making the federal government or the state government run like a business, a typical Republican statement, is this complete nonsense. It's not the same thing. There's no profit and loss statement in government. Read James Q. Wilson, who was a conservative, by the way, book, Bureaucracy. It's the classic work on the federal bureaucracy. I had him for a professor 45 years ago when I was getting my master's degree. And the problem with us right now is we're facing a catastrophe with the FAA. Why did they lay off air traffic controllers in an agency that doesn't have enough? They should have been investing more money to upgrade the electronic systems. Why? In the private sector, if one company fails, if General Motors, there's another option. You can go to Chrysler or Ford, you can go to Toyota. Who do you go to if the FAA fails? Santa Claus to run the airports of the country? There's only one FAA. There's little places in the federal government that run foreign aid. I'm not being mean now, but the MCC is $930 million. AID last year was $38 billion.
That's the Millennium Challenge Corporation,
Yes.
which also has been
It's also been
abolished.
By the way, to show you how screwed up things are in Washington right now, the OMB said we're going to keep the MCC alive. We like the concept. We're going to support it. They sent back 2-3 weeks ago their budget submission for 2026. The same day that Musk came in with Doge and said we're shutting down the agency. The same day. So apparently they're not speaking to each other. One of my friends who's a Republican said, you know, Andrew, it's far more chaotic than what it looks like. I said, it is. He said this is just one example of it. OMB said you're staying, and then they decided to abolish the MCC. Now I think the MCC should have been run out of AID. We helped design it. Let's not get into this right now, but the point is, it was working. Why screw around with something? My rule in government is, if something is working properly, don't mess with it. Now, people say that AID is full of, someone said it's full of fraud. I'm not going to attribute it to certain people, okay? It's very easy to find out, okay? Look at the audits. The Defense Department has not had a clean audit in 8 years. In fact, it's worse. It's one thing to have a clean audit. They can't even audit the books. And I'm a retired lieutenant colonel. I'm not a military basher. I don't think we should cut defense spending. But it's very poorly managed. How come they never went over there? I don't understand that. They went after AID. AID was ranked by a nonprofit, independent of the federal government, that ranks every federal department and agency every year on how well managed they are, whether they use evaluations and studies and scientific research to make decisions. Okay, there are 3 categories: gold, silver, and everyone else. Everyone else is most of the federal government. AID is a gold member and the 3rd best managed federal agency, according to an agency that goes in and tears the agency apart. I mean, for information, they don't do any bad stuff in any agency, but read their reports. I didn't make them up. They're not controlled by AID. And you can see how they're judged. Their AID is regarded as the 3rd best managed federal agency. And I might add, that's not just for 1 year, it's for many years. We fixed the systems that were screwed up 25 years ago. And they've been functioning very well. Now, they attempted to rip them out, the automated procurement system, the financial management system, to take them to state. And the career people said, you know, if you do what you're doing, you're going to destroy the system. And they said, what do you know about computers being snotty? They ripped it out, and guess what happened? The systems collapsed. And they cannot be, I asked one of the senior career management people who used to work for me, and I said, is it really destroyed? She said, Andrew, there's no way to repair it. It took 6 years and $100 million to install that system. It's destroyed now. States' financial management system was designed for a diplomatic institution, not for a project management agency. It's a completely different system. The procurement system in aid last year did 23,000 actions. 23,000 actions. It's one of the most sophisticated procurement systems in the federal government, even though we're relatively small compared to a lot of others. But it works very well. You can read the 125-page annual report that goes to Congress on and I know there are issues with it, but it works extraordinarily well under the circumstances. Now, let me get to the operational point. We are going to have a crisis. Raj Shah came to see me the day he was confirmed by the US Senate. And as the aid administrator under President Obama. And he asked the staff lead, I was teaching at Georgetown, and he said, do you have any advice? I said, go downstairs and talk to the OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disasters, which I ran 35 years ago for President George H.W. Bush. This was my first job in the federal government. And Food for Peace, and the Office of Transition Initiatives, the 3 sister agencies that run our emergency response. Because there's going to be an emergency, a crisis, and you're going to spend all your time on this crisis for 6 months. I told them that. Within 4 or 5 months, there was a massive earthquake in Haiti. 200,000 people, we think, died in the capital city and the surrounding areas. It was a catastrophe. And guess who was sent in with the U.S. military to run it? Now, the U.S. military likes AID. This is another interesting thing. People trash AID. You know, people say, well, the military doesn't like AID. That's not true. We work very well together. The DART team that stopped the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, it was AID that ran it. They were in the lead. The President Obama said, you're in charge. The Defense Department reported to us along with CDC. CDC didn't like it that we were in charge, but we were. And we stopped that from getting out of hand. It killed 12,000 people before we got there, but we did take care of it with the US military. We work with the military all the time. They like aid offices because they get stuff done. They're very operational. What was the thing I was saying?
I'll answer another accusation, which was thrown out in the last 90 days, that aid conducted policies overseas which were inconsistent with U.S. foreign policy or with directions of the chief of mission. Well, I've been chief of mission that's had at some places which have had the biggest AID programs. Yes. Cairo, yes, where I had to rebuild the program, yes, after a complete evacuation, right, of most of the staff and all of AID. The collaborative effort to learn from experience, to build programs that worked for critical strategic stabilization. Aid has evolved, the State Department has evolved, the coordination and cooperation, I can't speak for every chief of mission, right, but in any of the various missions I headed has been extraordinary for a common U.S. foreign policy goal. I do not know where the allegation of an insubordinate AID in the sense of U.S. foreign policy or direction of ambassadors comes from, because not only have I never seen it, I've never heard of such cases in the modern AID and modern foreign service. A further reminder, many of the programs which AID runs overseas are not the creation of the brain of AID. They are mandated by the Congress.
That's right.
Those programs, that level of funding, individual influential congresspersons require. It's their programs. So this is a complex web, not easily cut through by the kinds of accusations. But Andrew, I want to ask you one very big question before we turn to the audience. We're focused on the U.S., and that's appropriate. But there is a broader international set of humanitarian institutions. I see them every day in continuing to look closely at the Gaza situation, right, where when the U.S. isn't leading, nobody else is there to lead. When the U.S. is withdrawing its contribution to critical institutions, there's no fill behind. There is a donor exhaustion, yes, that's been a historic problem last decade, but it has accelerated on steroids with the perception that the U.S. isn't there. It becomes very easy for Germany, for France, for Britain to say, well, you know, U.S. is cutting back, so are we.
They're doing it.
And what's the implication of that, Andrew?
Well, the 40% of the UN budget is China and the United States. They don't expect any money from the U.S. from now on. And they haven't announced that, but that's effectively what's going to happen. The Chinese are not paying their dues. And I personally think the Chinese want the system to collapse. We don't know that for sure. They see the UN as a hostile, potentially hostile. And with a 40% reduction, there's already a 17% cut now. They've announced it. They're making layoffs across the system. Just when we need particularly UNICEF and the World Food Program and UNHCR, because they do the emergency response, not just long-term development stuff. So there's a big problem. But there's something else. I did not know this. It was very interesting. I've learned myself since I got engaged in this crusade to explain to the American people and the world what we're losing. And that is the supply chain system for health clinics, 10,000 health clinics in the global south, is AID. What does that mean? It means the antiretrovirals for AIDS, malaria medication, TB medication, immunizations for measles and for Ebola. Well, there's a vaccine out for Ebola now. For syringes, for medical disposables. And why do I say the whole system? I didn't know it, but the UN relies on aid to do all those purchases. Why? Because by centralizing all this in aid, the UN gets a much lower price. So the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, they get all their drugs from AID. I did not know that until 4 months ago, which is disastrous because the whole thing not only shut down the aid supply chain, it shut down the aid supply system for all the international health organizations in Geneva and for the UN. And then there's another thing I didn't know. It started when I was administrator. Someone might have told me. I thought I had a handle on everything at AID, but I didn't. We started a system to build the ministry of 130 countries with ministries of health to collect data on disease incidence, on morbidity rates, mortality rates, fertility rates, and that system has become more and more sophisticated, but it still requires a lot of AID intervention. They canceled the contract for that. And someone in the UN said to me, so well, you know what's going to happen now? We don't have any data. I said, we get the data from you. He said, no, we get the data from you. We never want to admit it because no one in the UN likes to admit they're dependent on the US. But that's where we get the stuff, from AID. And then the World Bank said, privately, one of the officers said, and Andrew, where do you think we get the data? I said, I thought we got it from you. Not in health, we get it from you. No health systems in AID managed, the whole thing is going to collapse. What's the frontline protection for us from a disease outbreak? Another pandemic. We're going to have another pandemic. Now we're going to have it more easily. Why? It's from these early warning systems that have been put in place. I wrote an article for Foreign Affairs when COVID started. By the way, we started the pandemic program at the Scowcroft Institute in 2015, 5 years before COVID. I asked Brent Scowcroft, I said, I'm going to start this program, Brent. You're probably going to get upset with me. He said, Andrew, I don't know why someone else didn't think it's a brilliant idea. You have my support. You don't have to ask my permission anyway. Just do what you want to do. But we predicted there would be a pandemic. We didn't know where. We didn't know how severe it would be. There's going to be another one. And I proposed in an article I wrote for Foreign Affairs in 2020, it was in July, the July issue, on a pandemic early warning system. We have a famine early warning system, which has been in operation since 1986. And it's predicted 87% of all famines, AID is predicted ahead of time. And that's why the number of famines has dramatically dropped, according to, in fact, they've almost, other than the North Korean famine, one or two others, we've wiped out famine until the last 4 or 5 years when things are beginning to deteriorate again, unfortunately. So we need a pandemic. Well, I didn't realize this. We had one in place, not as extensive as what I was arguing, but now we don't even have that in place anymore. And the career people at AID were telling me they were going to implement my idea, which makes me even more angry now that the whole thing's collapsing.
So, Andrew, looking at the questions from the audience, there are a couple common themes. One of them is, and so, what now? Are there private, are there other alternatives, a different restructuring, maybe under the same, maybe under a different name of what AID did, a focus only on some areas, disaster relief? What do you think?
Obviously, I would like to recreate what exists. And there's a project now to capture the knowledge of the career service before most of them are, because most of them are still actually, they were fired and then they were rehired until July 1st, and then September 1st, some of them will be kept on to. But there's a whole effort now to capture the knowledge base that they all have, so it's not lost in history. And I think we should publish a series of books on what we've learned, so if someone chooses to reconstruct this, that we will have a knowledge base to do that. How the business system, but people don't realize the business systems are critically important. It's not just doing good. It's how the business systems work. You don't just dole out $38 billion. You have to spend it very carefully if you want to get value for money. So what do we do in the future? All of our aid program was dispersed all over the federal government, which is not good, because some agencies were telling countries to do exactly the opposite, US agencies, than we were telling them. I can go into examples of it, but without going into, I don't want to trash any other federal agencies at this point because all of them are suffering right now. But there were conflicts. We took the developing world's perspective on things. And we looked at sustainability. When we finish the funding, will there be anything left? Does the project stop when we stop funding it, or does it continue because we built institutions that last for a long time? So the answer to your question is, I think we need a federal Department of International Development. I've argued this in articles that I wrote with Brian Atwood, who was the head of AID under Bill Clinton. He's a good friend of mine. In fact, we've written a bunch of articles together. And so I do think we need a department. I think the aid logo, Henrietta Holtzman Ford was the head of aid 2 after me, and she said it's worth $1 billion in terms of, she's a private businesswoman. She said the brand recognition of USAID from the American people is huge brand recognition all over the developing world. And from the American people is supposed to be in the local language, in Arabic or Spanish or whatever, Swahili. And so I think we've lost that, which is very sad, because it means people in the remote areas of the world, if you show the aid flag, they know what it is. If you show the American flag, sometimes they don't even know what that is. We did a test once, interestingly enough, and I was offended by the test, but they said the American flag to us represents, these are people in the military. I said, well, it doesn't to us. They said, yes, but to us it does in the developing. But the aid logo does not, we don't think of the US military, we think of our aid programs. I think that's kind of a good thing for us. Public diplomacy works. I can show you data on our approval as a country. Our favorability ratings massively increased when we show the aid flag, because people respect it. But I think we need to have a department, and I think we need to move the functions of CDC, international functions of CDC, USDA, the Treasury Department, state, and what was left of AID, and the MCC, and the DFC is a development bank that was passed by the Congress, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, and put them in one federal department. That's what I would suggest. If I had been asked, I would have told them, if you really want to fix the system, that's what I would suggest you do now. Because probably he could have got it, Musk could have got it done. Now, he did say something interesting, and I've written a book on aid, and it was due 2 weeks ago at the publisher. I've been writing it for 16 years, and a big publishing house from Britain approved it. And in the middle of the controversy over the destruction of aid, and I have to write a new chapter to explain what's happened, because it was about aid, and aid's, by the time the book comes out, it's not going to exist anymore. So I'm going to have to, my teaching assistant at I slipped, I was going to say Georgetown, at the Bush School, said we should use past tense. I said, this is very painful for me. You're going to have to do it. I can't bring myself to write the past tense for AID in the book. He said, we have to do it, or they're going to send it back from the publishing house. But we're trying to think through this very issue of what do we do. Now, what I said earlier is Raj Shah had to deal with this crisis in Haiti. The president is going to face crisis. I believe, this is my prediction, I know you're recording this, it's being streamed, this is the first time I've said this in public. Cuba is collapsing. The only reason they haven't had an explosion is a million Cubans, younger Cubans, have left the country for the United States and to Mexico, because the economy, it's not functioning anymore and people are hungry. I mean, it has luxuriant soils. I don't know why they're hungry. They're hungry because of a collective farming system that does not work. The electrical grid is collapsed. They try to rebuild it. And the Cuban government will blame us and all, and the sanctions are not the reason that the Venezuelan government has collapsed in the Cuban. Communism does not work. In fact, National Public Radio interviewed Fidel Castro in a nursing home. And the reporter said, he later denied he said it, But I was there, I did the interview, he said, communism does not work. Socialism does not work. That's what he said. Fidel Castro said that. The president, it's going to collapse, and all of a sudden 300,000 Cubans are going to get in little boats, and they're going to come to Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and Florida, and someone's going to say, we got to stop this. Well, you can stop this with punitive measures by putting the Coast Guard can't stop that. Okay, how do you stop it? You send teams in to give some hope to the Cuban people that we are going to help them build a market-based economy, fix public services, and maybe some people will go back to Cuba from the United States, which has happened in many other countries where we have intervened. And so they're going to look and say, why do we destroy aid? We need aid right now to help us rebuild Cuba. I think they've made a terrible mistake, and they're going to see it when this happens. Raj Shah used to run around saying, Andrew told me this was going to happen. He said, I didn't know, he didn't say it was going to be in Haiti, but it happened. Any aid administrator can tell you that. There's a big crisis, you focus on it. Maybe it won't be Cuba, maybe it will, who knows?
Andrew, if you could wave a wand, you're restarting a new system, that model you just outlined. What 2 or 3 things would you insist be done differently than in the past?
Well, Peter McPherson, who was the aid administrator under Ronald Reagan, and is regarded by the Career Service, the older career, as the greatest aid administrator since the agency was founded. And he was my mentor. He got me to go there, and he's still one of my very close friends. And he and I talk to each other several times a week and have for many years now. And Peter established an institute within AID. He didn't call it an institute, but you had to go through the course to graduate. I teach a course in development theory, and I sit here and say, I didn't have to read these books when I ran AID, and no one in the Career Service did. Many career people have read some of these books, but there are 9 schools of development that evolved from World War II. There is no common view of development. You learn it, and there's broad sort of amorphous sort of agreement, but there is not a curriculum with all the theories and worldviews. I think we need that. And so I would establish a system where to get into the Foreign Service after 2 years in waiting, there's a 2-year period where you, what's the term?
You're an untenured officer.
You're untenured, that's exactly right. I should know tenure track from, I don't have tenure.
And it's longer than 2 years.
It's longer than 2 years. But anyway, in the Foreign Service, you have to, before you can get tenure, you have to go through I would argue we need to have a system of education comparable to a master's degree, because everybody in AID has to have an advanced degree anyway to get into the Foreign Service. And that's true for the civil service system too. 2, we have 23 different personnel systems in aid. It's ridiculous. And it caused huge problems to Samantha Power. She tried to fix it. If we're starting from scratch, we should do what the CIA does. They have their own personnel system. It's not like the civil service system. It's one system. We have 23 mechanisms for hiring people. I finally, when I said, how many people work for us? And the reason how we found out, we counted the number of telephones in use. That's how we found out. We wouldn't have known otherwise, because there are so many contractors being hired. I would have meetings in I used to bring all of the younger officers in my room, because the senior officers sometimes would mistranslate to the junior officers my instructions. And the senior officer said, well, we'll communicate. And I said, no, you won't. I will. I want it, because you guys, sometimes when I tell you to do things you don't want to do, you don't tell the junior staff, and I don't like that. And they got the message, It did help discipline a little bit, because the junior officers would say, that's not what the administrator said. I was in the room when he said it. But anyway, I'd say, which personnel system hired you? Are you a institutional contractor? Are you, a PSC? And they would, there'd be like 10 different systems. That's ridiculous. We should have one personnel system. And so we know who works for the agency and who doesn't work for the agency. And the people are they don't get diplomatic protection the way a diplomat does or a civil servant when they travel abroad. That's ridiculous for me. The third thing is there are very high overhead rates. And the reason they're high overhead rates, people say, why does all these contractors and NGOs, they get all? Well, you know why? Because there's so many regulations. You know why there's so many regulations? Because Congress imposes, and so many rules. The federal acquisition regulations are 2,000 pages long. We have to comply with them. They're too complicated. They want more people from the developing world to bid on projects. I tried to read the FAR, it's called, myself. I almost opened the window on the 4th floor and jumped out. I called the staff in and I said, do you have any idea what this means? I mean, I'm maybe not the most brilliant person in the world, but I'm reasonably intelligent. What does this mean? He said, Andrew, it takes 4 years. I said, 4 years and probably a PhD in physics or a computer. How do you read this? It's worse than the IRS code. It's worse than the IRS. I wrote an article on this called The Clash of the Counter-Bureaucracy and Development. People in Congress say, you created all this bureaucracy. I said, no. You created it. You put in place the federal acquisition rate. We didn't create this. You did. You know, to travel in the developing world, you have to go through the GSA travel regulations. You know how long they are? 70 pages long of regulations to buy a ticket to travel. That's ridiculous. 70 pages? So I could go through and tell you, we counted when I wrote this article, what percentage of aid officers were what we call compliance officers, to make sure you comply with all the rules and regulations, no one steals any money. We spend more money preventing anyone from stealing money than money is stolen. I mean, I don't know why we do that. 40% of the staff are compliance officers. And I'm not criticizing those of you who are retired compliance officers. I'm not criticizing you. I'm saying, and a congressman asked me at the hearing, well, what is a compliance? And I started saying it. I said, you know, you have 265 earmarks on our budget. If we don't comply with every one of those, you will tear the aid administrator and the senior management apart. So we have officers all year long making sure every dollar is spent according to 268 earmarks. By the way, the earmarks are 125% of the budget. When I first came to AID, I said, wait a second. You gave us 265 earmarks, and they add up to 125%. How do we comply with them? He said, that's your problem. I had a congressional staffer told me that. I said, what do you mean it's my problem? You appropriated the money. I almost said, you moron, but I did not say that. I did not say it. Now, the staff knows, and I learned why they do that. You know why? Because interest groups go into the Congress, and they want more money. And so what they do is they just keep piling the earmarks on top of each other. Now, the way we comply, and the staff knows this, the congressional staffers actually are very smart people. I don't want to be too mean to them. What they do is they double count. So if there's microfinance loans, there's a $325 million microfinance earmark, and agriculture programs, we do microfinance for agriculture, and we double count it. And they know we're double counting it when we did it. And that way, the microfinance people think they're getting $325 million, and the agriculture people think, properly so, that we're getting $600 million for agriculture, okay? It's a little game that's played, and it makes the interest groups feel they have something when they, well, I suppose they do, but the earmarks are out of control. So if I had a choice, I'd get rid of the earmarks. I'd let people in the missions and the embassies, they should make the decisions with the country. It's their country. We shouldn't be telling them, because of interest group pressure in the United States, how to spend the money. Now, where the missions are located should be a decision of state and NAID and Defense and the White House. I argue that we should base where the missions are and how much money is allocated in general on our strategic interests from a geographic standpoint, because that's where the world is moving. And we're not thinking in those terms. We're thinking about the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. I've never supported them, to be very frank with you, because having centralized planning at the UN, the people in the developing world, they resent it, actually. And the finance ministers tell me they make up statistics. I said, how do you know for sure that 65% of the kids in this country in the middle of a civil war are in school? I said, we don't know that, Andrew. We made it up. I said, why did you make it up? Because there's no way of telling. Do you know for sure how many kids in your country are in the middle of a civil war? Yet, at least. I mean, we have very elaborate systems for data collection. They don't have them in the developing world. A lot of the data collection required by the World Bank and the UN, we do in health. The kid's either alive or the kid's dead. And you can test whether a child has measles or doesn't, how many kids there are in a family. It's easier in health, but in a lot of other areas, it's much more difficult to collect data. And so I think the system should be much more decentralized as it was during the Cold War. They used to call the aid mission directors proconsuls, and it was meant as an insult. I actually had someone in Washington, they're like the proconsuls during the Roman period. Like, I don't think they didn't mean it as a compliment. They meant they're too powerful. I said, yes, but what did they do? He said, well, they talked to the finance minister and the prime minister and the parliament and the national congresses of these countries and civil society. And there's a whole requirement in aid before we write a strategic plan. We have to get everybody's approval in the developing world, which is not easy to do. And so I think we should decentralize more power to the field and let the ambassador and the aid mission director make the decisions with the country instead of being made in Washington. So there's a lot of things I'd change, but they're not asking me. Given how many people I've insulted this evening, I'm sure I will not be asked.
Well, and Andrew, let me come to a close by noting I had spent 44 years in the Foreign Service. At the time I retired, I and one other colleague were the longest serving Foreign Service officers in the department. I thought I understood foreign policy and the management of missions, including AID, having rebuilt one of the biggest programs in the world. Then I came to the Gaza crisis, and I realized my expertise, important as it was, I knew all of the parties involved, knew all the individuals, did not encompass the technical and political skills that AID, my colleague Sonali Corday, who ran the USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, and a senior official from the State Department Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, PRM, which I had never really understood because it wasn't part of the world of high policy I fancied myself moving in. Their skills were invaluable throughout the period, that year, that we were attempting to avert famine, starvation successfully, that minimal bar. It is an extraordinary professional skill set which is not in the wheelbox of even the most experienced and senior Foreign Service officers.
Yep.
There is a place today, there will be a place tomorrow for that expertise from the simple bottom line standpoint of fundamental U.S. interests in either mitigating risk and harm or trying to advance a more positive environment in which the U.S. and Americans can prosper and be secure, those objectives which all of us can agree to. And it isn't just America not alone, but it is also America not deprived of the expertise in dealing with challenges that will come up with certainty.
Absolutely.
In our future. But Andrew, thank you again for coming back here, for speaking to us. All best, and we will continue this discussion with you, with other speakers coming in, because it's critical for the United States.
One last quick story, which I should have told at the beginning. My great uncle, his name was Demetrius Karadimas. He was a factory worker in Piraeus during the Second World War. The Nazis stripped the country of food to feed Rommel's army in North Africa, and 500,000 Greeks died. He was one of the deaths. Growing up, my father told me the story over and over again. I never forgot it. So this is more, for me personally, it's not just a matter of an agency, it's a matter of what happened to my family. So thank you all for coming this evening.
Thank you all. We got to get you on the road.